Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Revolutionized Hero Society with his notebook? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The hero's cape swayed in the wind like a crimson flag of victory, and the crowd watching erupted in cheers and cries that rattled the windows of Izuku's apartment 14 floors up. On the tablet screen, Flame Wing soared through the air with practiced grace, his quirk painting trails of fire against the afternoon sky as he pursued the fleeing villain across Muzutafu's skyline. And there we have it, folks. The news anchor's voice crackled through the speakers, as her perfectly modulated enthusiasm cut through the ambient noise of the city and permeated into Izuku's room. Another successful operation by our pro-heroes, with minimal property damage and no civilian casualties reported. What an amazing fight! Izuku Midoriya sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by a fortress of notebooks, their pages worn soft from constant handling. His green eyes tracked every movement on the screen with the intensity of a hawk watching its prey, pupils dilating and contracting as he processed visual information faster than most people could follow dialogue. At 15, he'd perfected his art of analysis, every gesture catalogued, every tactical decision dissected, every victory and failure documented in his careful handwriting that had grown smaller and more precise over the years to fit more observations on each page. His current notebook, number 13 in a series that had started when he was little, lay open beside him, filled with diagrams of quirk applications, timing charts for response rates, and profiles of both heroes and villains that might even have impressed graduate-level analysis students. The margins were crammed with additional observations, corrections to previous theories, and cross-references to other cases he'd studied. But something was wrong with this picture. His pen stilled against the page as he watched Flame Wing corner the villain, Smokescreen, according to the ticker at the bottom of the screen, against the glass facade of a nearby downtown office building. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to capture the dramatic conclusion, while police cordoned off the area in a loose perimeter that left far too many potential escape routes, in his opinion. Izuku's frantic eyes immediately catalogued some usual errors he had noticed through the years: insufficient crowd control, inadequate perimeter security, and a positioning that gave the villain multiple exit vectors. "Wait," Izuku muttered, frowning as he leaned forward until his nose was almost touching his screen. His shoulders hunched as a bit of anxiety crawled up his spine. Not his usual kind that made him want to hide, but a restless, electric type that came when his mind caught onto something that would later prove to be important. Oh no, that's not Dash. As if timed, on screen, Flame Wing launched a burst of blazing feathers at the villain's position. The direction was precise, controlled, exactly the kind of technique that had earned him his ranking as the number 17 hero. Smokescreen's quirk activated in response, billowing gray clouds that obscured the entire intersection. The hero dove blind into the smoke. Izuku's pen moved frantically across the page, documenting what some hadn't noticed, what the cheering crowd missed. His hand cramped from the rapid writing, but he couldn't stop. The pattern was there, clear as daylight if you knew how to look. The familiar excitement of discovery raced up his body, the same feeling he'd gotten when he'd first noticed that All Might's rescue times correlated with local traffic patterns, or when he'd identified the behavioral tells that preceded Endeavor's most devastating attacks. The villain's smoke wasn't random, it couldn't have been. It followed a pattern, concentrated heaviest near the building's main entrance, where a steady stream of office workers had been evacuating. The gradients were subtle but consistent, creating channels that guided civilian movement in specific directions. Smokescreen wasn't trying to escape. He was hurting civilians. No, Izuku breathed, scribbling notes in the margins with increasing urgency. His voice caught slightly as he muttered to himself, not quite a stutter, but close. When he got worked up like this, words sometimes tangled in his throat like fishing lines, thoughts moving faster than his ability to articulate them. The smoke density near the east exit, he's forcing them toward the construction zone. Flame Wing, you need to... But the hero emerged from the smoke cloud empty-handed. The villain had vanished, leaving behind only the clouding scent of his smoke and a dozen confused civilians who'd taken shelter in what they thought was a safe zone, directly beneath an active construction crane whose safety protocols had been disabled 3 days ago, according to a building permit violation that had been buried on the municipal records. Izuku had read those records. He read everything when he noticed the news report about this fight. The news cameras panned to show Flame Wing's triumphant pose, arms raised to acknowledge the crowd's applause. The hero's costume was pristine except for minor soot stains, his breathing barely elevated. To any observer, this looked like a rather successful encounter. Though he hadn't been caught, the villain had been driven off with no casualties and minimal property damage. "Crisis averted," the anchor declared, her smile bright enough to power a small city. Though the villain escaped, no one was hurt, thanks to the quick thinking of our number 17 hero. Izuku stared at the screen, his chest tight with something between frustration and disbelief. The familiar weight of being someone who saw the truth pressed down on him. This wasn't quick thinking, this was purely blind luck. No one was hurt because Smokescreen had chosen not to hurt them. The construction crane's load hadn't fallen because the villain had decided not to trigger the obvious trap he'd most likely spent setting up, probably for the hero himself. This wasn't supposed to be a victory, at least to him. It was much more like luck masquerading as one, and everyone was celebrating. The worst part was how obvious the deception seemed in hindsight. Smokescreen had been active for 3 months, with each encounter following a similar pattern: dramatic confrontation, flashy escape, minimal actual damage. The media loved him because he provided spectacle without tragedy. Heroes didn't worry about fighting him because he wasn't particularly aggressive, and it made them look good without putting themselves in serious danger. The public loved watching because it was exciting without being genuinely frightening. Everyone was getting what they wanted. Everyone except the people who might become victims when Smokescreen finally revealed what he truly wanted. His phone buzzed against the floor beside him, the vibration unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of his room. A news alert: Smokescreen strikes again, 3rd bank robbery this month baffles heroes. The notification sent a chill down Izuku's spine, not because of what it said, but because of what it confirmed. The pattern crystallized in Izuku's mind with sudden, horrible clarity. 3 robberies, 3 dramatic chases, 3 narrow escapes that weren't escapes at all, they were tests. Smokescreen had been studying hero response times, tactical patterns, and civilian evacuation procedures. Each encounter had been a data-gathering exercise, and the heroes had played right into his hands. It was brilliant, really. Very methodical. Also terrifying in its implications. And nobody else seemed to see it. Izuku's breathing quickened as the full scope of what he was looking at became clear. This wasn't just a villain committing crimes, this was a researcher conducting systematic field studies on the hero system itself. Every failed robbery had generated massive amounts of data about police responses, hero deployment strategies, civilian behavior under stress, and media coverage patterns. Smokescreen probably wasn't planning to steal money. He seemed to be planning to break the system. The news feed continued scrolling across the bottom of the screen, each headline a piece of the puzzle. Hero response times increase citywide. New evacuation protocols under review. Public confidence in heroes remains high despite villain escapes. Each piece of information was being gathered, cataloged, and analyzed. Just like Izuku himself, yet for completely different reasons, Smokescreen was building a comprehensive understanding of how Mizudafu's hero system functioned under stress. When he finally made his real move, he'd know exactly how to exploit every weakness, every blind spot, every overconfident assumption. "Izuku, dinner's ready," his mother's voice called from the kitchen, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "Just a minute," he replied, already reaching for another one of his notebooks where he tracked villain behavioral patterns. His fingers flew through the pages, cross-referencing dates and locations, mapping the subtle evolution of Smokescreen's techniques. Each encounter built on the previous one, adding new variables, testing different responses, and refining the data collection process. The villain was definitely learning from each encounter, adapting his approach based on hero responses. But the heroes? They kept using the same tactics, the same assumptions, the same blind spots that Smokescreen had already identified and cataloged. They were fighting yesterday's battle while their opponent was preparing for tomorrow's. His tablet droned on in the background as Izuku worked, the anchor's voice a constant stream of excitement. Sources close to Firewing's Hero Agency assure us that new strategies are being developed. New strategies. Izuku's pen stilled again, hovering over a half-finished sentence. What strategies? Faster pursuit techniques? Better coordination with local police? But all of those solutions addressed the same thing. They were still treating Smokescreen like a common criminal instead of the methodical researcher he most likely was. The worst part was how obvious it all seemed now. 3 months of data, all publicly available through news reports, police statements, and social media posts. Anyone with access to a computer and the patience to cross-reference databases could have pieced it together. But nobody was doing that kind of analysis, or at least none of the more authoritative figures. Nobody was looking at the big picture. They were all too focused on individual incidents to see the pattern emerging. Just like they did with everything else. Just like they did with him. Izuku had been trying for 3 years to get teachers, classmates, or anyone to pay attention to his analysis. He'd written detailed reports on hero efficiency, submitted tactical recommendations to agency websites, and even tried to present his findings at a local academic conference. The responses were always the same: polite dismissal, patronizing encouragement to keep up the good work, suggestions that he focus on more realistic career goals. Nobody wanted to hear what a quirkless kid had to say about hero work, no matter how thorough his research or how accurate his predictions proved to be. A familiar ache of isolation settled in his chest, not sharp like physical pain but persistent like a low-grade fever. He was used to being ignored, but moments like this, when he could see disaster approaching and nobody would listen, made the loneliness feel almost unbearable. Izuku! His mother's voice carried a note of concern now. Your food's getting cold. Coming, Mom. He capped his pen and set down the notebook, but his mind continued working as he made his way to the kitchen. Inko Midoriya looked up from her place at their small dining table, her green eyes, so similar to his own, taking in his appearance with the practiced assessment of a mother who'd learned to read the signs of her son's worries. Her round face held a particular expression he knew well, loving concern mixed with gentle exasperation. She'd set the table with their usual care, proper placemats, napkins folded just so, chopsticks aligned perfectly, small rituals that imposed order on their modest life. Rough day? She asked gently, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. The table was set with their usual simplicity: rice, miso soup, grilled fish, and pickled vegetables. Truly, it was nothing fancy, but he knew it was prepared with the care that had sustained them both through the years. The fish was grilled just the way he liked, the rice fluffy and warm, the miso soup still steaming in its bowl. Izuku slid into his seat and picked up his chopsticks, though his appetite had fled somewhere between the news report and his revelation about Smokescreen's methodology. His stomach felt knotted, the way it always did when his mind was churning too fast for his body to keep up. The familiar comfort of their dinner routine felt distant, overshadowed by the weight of what he'd discovered. Not rough, exactly. But thinking. About heroes again? There was no judgment in her voice, just the patient understanding of someone who'd watched her son fill more and more notebooks with hero analysis over the past years. She'd stopped asking about his future plans after the middle school career counseling meeting where his teacher had suggested simpler options, with the delicacy of a sledgehammer. Instead, she'd learned to recognize the signs of his analytical spirals and started trying to provide a gentle anchor back to reality. About patterns, Izuku said, taking a bite of fish without really tasting it. His leg bounced under the table. The food was good, he knew that intellectually, but his mind was too occupied to appreciate it properly. Mom, do you ever wonder why smart people sometimes make the same mistakes over and over again? Inko tilted her head thoughtfully, setting down her chopsticks to give him her full attention. It was something he loved about her. When he talked, really talked, she listened like it mattered. She didn't dismiss his observations as childish rambling or try to redirect him toward age-appropriate topics. She engaged with his ideas as if they had value, even when she didn't fully understand them. I suppose it depends on whether they realize they're making mistakes at all. Sometimes we get so focused on doing something the way we've always done it that we forget to step back and ask if it's actually working. The simplicity of her observation hit him like a physical blow. It was such a basic concept, so fundamental, yet somehow multiple people keep missing it entirely. Heroes weren't stupid, their training regimens were grueling, their strategic education extensive, their real-world experience vast. He knew this. But they were trapped in their own success stories, following protocols that had worked in the past without questioning whether those protocols would work against newer and evolving threats. It was like trying to solve calculus problems with elementary arithmetic. The tools weren't inherently wrong, but they weren't sufficient for the complexity of the actual problem. The thoughts sparked a cascade of connections in his mind. Hero education focused on quirk development and physical conditioning, with strategy taught as a secondary skill. Most heroes learned tactics through trial and error rather than systematic study. They developed expertise in responding to immediate threats but little understanding of long-term patterns or even evolutionary adaptations in villain behavior. They were reactive rather than proactive, tactical rather than strategic. "What if," Izuku said slowly, his words gaining speed as the idea took shape, "what if the way heroes approach problems is fundamentally flawed?" His mother's chopsticks paused halfway to her mouth, her expression shifting to the focused attention she gave his more serious observations. "What do you mean?" "I mean dash." The words started pouring out before he could stop them, the way they always did when a new connection sparked in his brain. His hands began moving as he talked, sketching invisible diagrams in the air between them, his excitement overriding his usual social anxiety. What if quirks make heroes overconfident? What if having all that power makes them rely too much on direct confrontation and not enough on actual thinking? The explanation tumbled out in a rush, years of observations finally finding voice. This was what happened when his anxiety transformed into excitement. The words came too fast, his thoughts racing ahead of his ability to articulate them clearly. His mother had learned to follow these rapid-fire explanations, but he could see her struggling to keep up with the connections he was making. Take Smokescreen, for example. He isn't just a villain with a smoke quirk, he's a researcher. He's been running experiments on hero response patterns, and they don't even realize it because they're too focused on the immediate threat to see the bigger picture. Izuku paused to take a breath, his chest tight with the effort of organizing his thoughts into coherent speech. His mother's patient attention gave him the confidence to continue, to lay out the full scope of what he'd discovered. Every encounter follows the same formula: dramatic confrontation, flashy quirk display, villain escapes with minimal actual harm done. But it's not random, it's systematic data collection. He's mapping response times, analyzing hero psychology, documenting tactical blind spots. The heroes think they're fighting a criminal, but they're actually participating in a research study of a soon-to-be mastermind. The words hung in the air between them, and Izuku realized he was breathing hard, as if he'd been running. The excited energy that had carried him through the explanation was already beginning to fade, leaving behind the familiar anxiety that came with sharing his insights with someone else. Then the heroes keep giving him exactly the information he wants because they can't see past their own assumptions about how villain encounters are supposed to work. He finished, his voice dropping to a more reserved volume. Inko set down her chopsticks again entirely and leaned forward, her expression shifting from casual interest to genuine concern. Not for his ideas, but for the intensity with which he was expressing them. She'd seen this before, her son disappearing into his own mind, following connections that made perfect sense to him but left everyone else struggling to keep up. "Izuku, that's a very sophisticated observation." "But it's obvious," he protested, gesturing with his own chopsticks in a way that would have earned a gentle scolding under normal circumstances. His voice cracked slightly on the word obvious, the way it sometimes did when he felt like he was shouting into the void. Anyone who's been paying attention could see it. The timing, the locations, the way he always has an escape route planned. He's not committing crimes, he's conducting research. And the heroes keep giving him exactly the data he wants because they just can't see past their own assumptions. The words came out sharper than he'd intended, frustration bleeding into his voice despite his efforts to stay calm. This was the part he hated most, the moment when his excitement about a discovery crashed into the reality that nobody else seemed to care about the same things he did. The familiar flush of embarrassment crept up his neck as he realized how he must sound, a quirkless teenager lecturing his mother about professional hero work, as if his theoretical knowledge could compare to actual field experience. But the analysis was solid. He'd checked and double-checked his work, cross-referenced multiple sources, and built predictive models that had proven accurate in previous cases. The data didn't lie, even if nobody wanted to hear what it was saying. And you can. The question was asked without skepticism, but with the careful tone of a mother trying to understand her son's perspective without inadvertently crushing his spirit. Izuku's enthusiasm faltered slightly, deflating like a punctured balloon. The excited energy that had carried him through his explanations suddenly felt hollow, leaving behind the familiar ache of isolation. I think so? I've been tracking his patterns for weeks, and the data is right there in the public records. Anyone could access it. He paused, staring down at his barely touched dinner, his legs still bouncing under the table. But that's the problem, isn't it? No one's looking. They're too busy being heroes to actually think like heroes. Don't get me wrong, I still love heroes and hero work, but this is just so frustrating. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual, weighted with all the unspoken implications of what he'd just said. His mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and grounding in a way that made his chest tight for entirely different reasons than his earlier frustration. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you know I've always been proud of how much you care about heroes. Your analysis, your dedication, it's remarkable. But sometimes I worry that you're putting so much energy into studying other people's work that you're not thinking about what you want to do with your own life." That was a question that lurked beneath every conversation about heroes, every filled notebook, every late night spent analyzing footage of battles he'd never be strong enough to join. What was the point of understanding hero work better than the heroes themselves if he could never be one of them? The familiar weight of his quirklessness settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. For all his analysis, all his insights, all his desperate need to contribute something meaningful to the world of heroes, he was still just a powerless kid watching from the sidelines. It was the cruel arithmetic of their society: quirk plus training plus license equaled hero. Without that first variable, the equation never balanced, no matter how high the other numbers climbed. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands stilled on the table, no longer animated by excitement. I used to hope that maybe if I understood it well enough, if I could see things that others missed, maybe that would be enough. Maybe I could find a way to help, even without a quirk." The words felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging a truth he'd been fighting against for years. In a world where teens with flashy quirks were already planning their hero careers, what place was there for someone whose only talent was noticing things others missed? And now I think I've been lying to myself. The words tasted bitter, like medicine that had sat too long in the bottle. His shoulders hunched inward, making him look smaller than his 15 years. What's the point of being able to see patterns if no one will listen to a quirkless kid? What's the point of having insights if there's no way to act on them? The question hung between them like a physical thing, solid and unmovable. This was the wall he'd been running up against for 3 years, the fundamental barrier that made all his knowledge feel worthless. Society had clear rules about who got to be a hero and who got to watch from the sidelines. Understanding those rules didn't make them any less absolute. Do you think helping from the sidelines is worthless? The question caught him off guard, partly because of its simplicity and partly because he couldn't immediately answer it. He'd been so focused on the traditional image of heroism, as in standing in the spotlight, using quirks to save people directly, that he'd never seriously considered the infrastructure that made those moments possible. He started to say yes, then stopped. Was it worthless? When he thought about it logically, support roles were crucial to hero operations. Command centers coordinated rescue efforts during disasters. Analysts like the famous detective Tsukachi solved cases that prevented crimes before they happened. Strategic planners developed the protocols that kept heroes alive and effective. But emotionally, the idea of being relegated to the background while others claimed the spotlight felt like accepting defeat before the battle had even begun. It felt like settling for less than what he'd always dreamed of becoming. His mother seemed to read the conflict in his expression, the way she always could. She had an uncanny ability to see past his words to the feelings underneath, to understand the fears he couldn't articulate. You know, when I was your age, I wanted to be a teacher. I dreamed of inspiring young minds, of making a difference in children's lives. I planned my whole future around that one goal, what university I'd attend, what subjects I'd specialize in, how I'd transform education through innovative teaching methods. Izuku looked up from his cooling dinner, surprised by this revelation. His mother rarely talked about her own dreams. But I was so focused on that one specific vision that I almost didn't notice other opportunities to help people. I was convinced that classroom teaching was the only way I could make a meaningful difference in young lives. What changed? You did. Her smile was soft, tinged with a melancholy that made Izuku's chest ache. Becoming a mother taught me that there are many ways to nurture and guide and inspire. I may not have a classroom full of students, but I have a son who sees the world in ways that constantly amaze me. That's not the future I planned, but it's the one that gave my life meaning. The parallel wasn't lost on him, but it also felt like cold comfort. His mother had found fulfillment in an unexpected path, but she'd also had to give up her original dream entirely. Was that what he was supposed to do? Let go of everything he'd ever wanted and hope he could find meaning in whatever scraps were left? The comparison also highlighted another uncomfortable truth. His mother had found her alternative purpose through circumstances largely beyond her control. She hadn't chosen to give up teaching to become a mother, life had simply directed her toward a different path. But Izuku's situation was different. He was actively being excluded from his chosen field, locked out by biological circumstances he couldn't change. You really think my analysis matters? I think your perspective matters, she corrected gently, reaching across to squeeze his hand. Whether that becomes analysis or something else entirely, that's for you to decide. But first, you have to decide what question you're really trying to answer. What do you mean? Inko stood and began clearing the table, her movements efficient and practiced. She'd been managing their small household alone since his father's work took him overseas when Izuku was tiny, and the quiet competence she'd developed in those years sometimes made him forget how young she'd been when she'd had to figure it all out. You've been studying heroes for years, collecting information about their strengths and weaknesses, analyzing their methods and their mistakes. But what's the real question driving all that research? What is it that you're actually trying to understand? Izuku helped gather the dishes, his mind turning over her question like a puzzle box with no obvious solution. What was he trying to understand? The nature of heroism? The mechanics of quirk applications? The psychology of people who chose to dedicate their lives to saving others? As they worked together in comfortable silence, washing and drying dishes with the rhythm of long practice, a different possibility began to emerge. Maybe he'd been asking the wrong questions all along. Instead of, how do quirks work? Or, what makes someone heroic? Maybe he should be asking something simpler and more fundamental. The warm water and familiar routine of washing dishes helped calm his racing thoughts, creating space for deeper reflection. This was often how his best insights came, not in moments of intense focus, but in quiet spaces where his subconscious could process information without the pressure of active analysis. What if, he said suddenly, causing his mother to look up from the pot she was scrubbing, what if I've been studying heroes backwards? How so? I've been trying to understand what makes them succeed and how their quirks make up a big part of it, but what if I should be studying what makes them fail? The idea gained momentum as he spoke, puzzle pieces clicking together in his mind. His hands moved as he explained, sketching patterns in the soapy water. Everyone focuses on seeing victories, the amazing saves, the moments when everything goes right. But failures reveal weaknesses. They show you what doesn't work and why. Medical researchers don't just study healthy patients, they study diseases to understand how to prevent them. Engineers don't just analyze successful structures, they investigate failures to improve their projects. But hero work focuses almost exclusively on successes, as if we can learn everything we need from watching things go right. The more he thought about it, the more obvious the oversight seemed. Again, failure analysis was a cornerstone of improvement in virtually every professional field. Pilots studied crashes to enhance aviation safety. Doctors analyzed medical errors to prevent future mistakes. Scientists learned as much from failed experiments as from successful ones. But hero work seemed to exist in a bubble where failures were quickly forgotten, swept aside by the next spectacular success. If you can understand why something failed, you can figure out how to prevent that failure in the future. And if you can prevent failures. He trailed off as the full implications hit him, his eyes widening with the sudden clarity of it. You can save more people? Inko dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face him fully, recognizing the shift in his demeanor. So your question isn't really about heroes at all, his mother observed with a gentle smile. It's about helping people. The truth of that statement resonated through him like a bell. All his hero analysis, all his tactical observations, all his frustrated critiques of professional strategies, they weren't born from a desire to understand heroes for their own sake. They were born from a deep, persistent need to understand how people could be helped more effectively. It was such a simple revelation that he almost laughed. Of course it was about saving people. Everything had always been about saving people. The rest, the hero worship, the quirk hyperfocuses, was just methodology, means to an end rather than the end itself. The realization shifted something fundamental in his understanding of himself. He wasn't someone who just wanted to be a hero. He was someone who wanted to save people and had assumed that heroism was the only path to that goal. But what if it wasn't? But how does a quirkless kid, who is barely taken seriously by others around him, truly contribute to saving people? He asked, the familiar frustration creeping back into his voice. Even with this new understanding, the fundamental obstacle remained the same. Society had very specific rules about who was allowed to participate in life-saving work, and those rules didn't include people like him. Even if I can identify problems, even if I can see solutions that others miss, what's the point if I can't act on them? Who says you can't act on them? Izuku blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. It seemed so obvious that he almost didn't know how to respond. I don't have a quirk, Mom. I can't fight villains or rescue people from burning buildings or dash. Those aren't the only ways to act, she interrupted gently but firmly. You could write. Publish your analysis. Present your findings to hero agencies. Become a researcher or consultant. You could even try getting into hero work and adapting it to your liking. The suggestion hung in the air between them, foreign but not entirely unwelcome. He'd never seriously considered academic or research paths. They seemed so removed from the immediate, visceral act of heroism he'd always craved. But maybe they didn't have to be. Think about that one detective you always talk about, his mother continued, warming to the idea. I forgot his name, but he saves people by solving cases, by preventing crimes before they happen, or maybe even catching a criminal before he commits even more crimes. He uses investigation and analysis rather than quirks, though he does use his quirk to help him out based on what you've told me. Or what about the people who design support equipment? They save lives by making heroes more effective. Each example she provided felt like a small revelation. He'd been so focused on direct intervention, on being the person who threw the punch or caught the falling civilian, that he'd overlooked all the other ways people contributed to saving lives. You think anyone would listen to a teenager? I think anyone with sense would listen to good ideas, regardless of where they came from. And besides, you won't be a teenager forever. The question is, what do you want to be working toward while you grow up? The question settled into his mind like a seed, carrying with it the potential for an entirely different future than the one he'd imagined. Instead of dreaming about the day he'd miraculously develop a quirk, he could start building toward a career in hero research or tactical analysis. Instead of feeling frustrated by his powerlessness, he could develop the skills that would let him contribute meaningfully to saving people. Maybe it wouldn't be the spotlight heroism he'd always fantasized about, but it would be real. It would be his. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable quiet, both of them lost in thought as they finished the dishes and settled into their usual routines. But something had shifted between them, an understanding that this conversation had marked a turning point. That night, Izuku lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mother's words echoing in his mind alongside the images from the news report that had started it all. Somewhere in the city, Smokescreen was probably analyzing today's encounter, refining his understanding of hero response patterns, preparing for his next experiment. Meanwhile, the heroes who'd failed to catch him were likely reviewing the encounter through the lens of what they already knew, missing the larger pattern because they were too close to see it. But Izuku could see it. From his bedroom, floors above the street, surrounded by notebooks filled with observations, he could see the shape of something that the professionals had missed. The question was, what was he going to do about it? He rolled over and reached for the notebook on his bedside table. A new one, purchased that afternoon with his allowance money. Its pages were blank. The familiar weight of it in his hands was comforting, but tonight it felt different. Not like one of his usual notebooks, but like a tool for something he couldn't quite name yet. On the first page, he wrote a single line that seemed to capture everything he'd been thinking, everything he'd been feeling, everything he'd been trying to understand for the past 3 years. Why do heroes consistently make the same strategic mistakes, and how can those mistakes be prevented? It wasn't the question he'd expected to be asking when he'd started watching that news report today. It wasn't the question a quirkless kid was supposed to ask about the heroes he was still admired so much. But it was his question, born from his observations, demanding his attention in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The words looked small on the vast beige page, but they carried the weight of a new beginning. This wasn't about simply becoming a hero anymore. This was about becoming something else entirely. Something that maybe didn't exist yet in the narrow categories society used to organize people's lives. He stared at the words until his eyes grew heavy, his mind already beginning to churn with possibilities. Tomorrow, he would begin trying to answer his question. He would start treating his hero analysis like the scientific research it had always wanted to be, with proper methodology, testing, and all the tools that real researchers use to understand the world. He didn't know where that path would lead, or whether anyone would care about his conclusions, but for the first time in years, he had a direction that felt entirely his own. The notebook waited on his nightstand, its first question written in careful handwriting. Soon, it would be joined by observations, hypotheses, experiments, and all the messy consequences of asking such a question. But tonight, it was enough to have even asked the question at all. Outside his window, the city hummed with the quiet energy of a world where heroes and villains played their eternal game of cat and mouse, each side believing they understood the rules while missing the larger patterns that connected their individual battles into something vast and complex and beautiful. Somewhere in that complexity, Izuku was beginning to suspect, lay the answer to questions no one else was asking. But then again in the morning, the real work would begin. Tonight, all he did was close the notebook and go to sleep. A researcher needs it after all. The Musudafu Public Library stood like a monument made of pure accumulated knowledge, its cream facade softened by decades of aging. It was a breathtaking place, one of the biggest libraries in all of Japan, and one of the most sophisticated too. At 7 in the morning on a Saturday, the building cast long shadows across the empty plaza, its windows reflecting the golden light of dawn. If the boy weren't vibrating with excitement deep in his bones, he would have taken a moment to at least look at the sunrise. Izuku arrived 30 minutes before the opening time, his yellow backpack heavy with notebooks and his mind buzzing with the previous night's talk. The question he'd previously written had subconsciously evolved overnight into a dozen sub-questions, each demanding its own answers. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through possibilities like a kid finding a new candy store in the background. Every time he'd closed his eyes, a new hypothesis sparked. What if support equipment could compensate for blind spots? How did other countries handle hero-villain encounters? Were there any historical examples of quirkless individuals contributing to public safety? The security guard, an older man with a tortoise-shell quirk that made his skin look like overlapping plates, recognized him from his frequent visits and waved him through as soon as the automatic doors hummed to life. Izuku had become something of a fixture here over the past years, known among the staff as the intense green-haired boy who read everything from chemistry manuals to obscure historical texts with equal fervor. "Good morning, Midoriya-kun," the guard said with a gentle smile that crinkled the scales around his eyes. "The reference section. Again. Good morning, sir." He bowed in respect, voice a pitch higher. "Actually, I was thinking about trying the archives today," Izuku replied, adjusting his backpack straps nervously. The archives required special permission to enter, containing older documents, academic papers, and materials that some could deem too specialized for general circulation. "I'm researching something specific about support roles in hero work." The guard's expression shifted to something Izuku couldn't quite read, not quite pity, but close enough to make his stomach twist. It was a look he'd seen before, usually from adults who thought they understood what a quirkless kid was really searching for in all those hero-related texts. "Third floor, East Wing. You'll need to fill out a request form at the desk, though. Librarian Sato-san should be up there already, since she likes to sort the new acquisitions before the crowds arrive. You know of her, right?" He perked up at the name. She was one of the most supportive people in his life when it came to his research, and she had helped him loads over the years. "Oh yes, of course. Thank you again, hope you have a good shift." Izuku thanked him and headed for the stairs, taking them two at a time despite the weight of his backpack. The library's morning silence felt sacred, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps and the distant hum of the climate control systems protecting the precious documents housed within. The archive section occupied half of the third floor, separated from the general stacks by a glass wall that made it look like an aquarium filled with knowledge instead of fish. Librarian Sato, a middle-aged woman whose quirk let her instantly memorize any text she touched, looked up from a cart of books as he approached. "Midoriya-kun. Great to see you around here." She greeted him with the particular warmth reserved for regular patrons who treated books with proper respect. "What brings you to my domain this morning?" "Good morning, Sato-san. I'm researching non-quirk contributions to hero work," he smiled, pulling out the notebook where he'd outlined his research parameters the night before. His handwriting from last night looked frantic in the morning light, but the logic was solid. "More specifically, I'm looking for any information about support equipment designers, tactical coordinators, intelligence analysts, just about anyone who contributes to hero operations without directly engaging in field work." Sato's fingers drummed against the desk as she processed his request, her quirk likely helping her call up relevant catalog entries. "Huh, that's quite a specific topic. Most people interested in support roles focus on the technical aspects, like engineering, costume design, that sort of thing. You're looking for something more comprehensive, right?" "Yes, I want to understand the full ecosystem. How things affect each other." Izuku explained, warming to the subject. His hands began their familiar dance of gesture and emphasis, mapping out invisible connections in the air. "From what I can see, heroes don't operate in isolation. There has to be an entire infrastructure supporting them, but nobody really seems to talk about it. The media focuses on the dramatic moments, like the fights and the rescues, but I'm curious about the people who plan the operations. Who analyzes the data? Who makes the decisions?" "Ah." Sato's expression brightened with understanding. "You're not just looking for technical roles. You're interested in the more analytical and strategic positions." "Exactly." Relief flooded through him at being understood so quickly. Usually, he had to explain his ideas 3 or 4 times before people grasped what he was really asking. "Well, you're in luck. We recently received a donation of papers from a retired hero coordinator who worked with the Hero Public Safety Commission in the early days of quirk regulation. There's also a collection of academic journals focused on hero support operations, though they're quite technical." She pulled out a tablet and began typing rapidly. "And if you're interested in the analytical side, you might want to look at the published works of UA's Principal Nizu. He wrote several papers on strategic thinking in hero operations before taking his current position." Izuku's pen flew across his notebook pages, writing down every reference. Principal Nizu, he knew the name, of course. Everyone did. The high-spec quirk user who ran the most prestigious hero school in Japan. But published papers? Academic work that might be accessible to someone like him? His papers are particularly interesting, Sato continued, warming to the topic in the way librarians did when matching patrons with perfect resources. He wrote them under a pseudonym initially, Muse, because there was significant prejudice against non-human-appearing quirk users in academic circles at the time. Their brilliant analyses of tactical thinking, pattern recognition, and strategic planning in crises. She led him deeper into the archives, past shelves of bound periodicals and filing cabinets that probably contained more information than he could process in a lifetime. The air here smelled different, older, dustier, carrying the weight of knowledge like sediment at the bottom of an ocean. He loved it. If it were a perfume or a house scent, he'd buy the entire stock. Here. She pulled out a slim box of manuscripts, handling them with the reverence reserved for rare texts. These are copies of the original coordinator's papers. And over here, she moved to another section, the journal collection. The Nizu papers are in the special collection, which requires additional permissions, but I can get you photocopies of the most relevant ones. Izuku accepted the materials like holy relics, already imagining the insights they might contain. Thank you, Sato-san. This is exactly what I was looking for. One more thing, she added, pulling out a final volume. This might interest you. It's a comparative study of hero support systems across different countries. Japan's model is actually quite unique. Most nations integrate their support staff more directly into hero operations. The separation between field heroes and support personnel that we have here isn't universal. The weight of possibility in that statement made Izuku's hands tremble slightly as he accepted the book. Other models. Other ways of organizing hero work that might not draw such sharp lines between those with quirks and those without. He settled at a big table near the windows, spreading his materials out in a careful semicircle. The space was so big that it made the papers look small. The morning sun painted golden rectangles across the aged wood, and for a moment, the scene felt almost ceremonial. The coordinator's papers came first. Written in the early days of experimental heroism, they painted a picture of chaos gradually organizing into structure. The author, Yamada Koji, had been a police officer before heroics gained its traction, and his perspective bridged the gap between traditional law enforcement and the new reality of superpowered crime fighting. The tendency to view quirk-enhanced individuals as fully separate from baseline humans has created an artificial division in public safety operations, one passage read. This segregation not only limits security options but also creates dangerous blind spots in our response protocols. Izuku's pencil quickly filled his own notebook, writing down passages that resonated with his own observations. The author had seen it too, the way quirks had created a caste system that sometimes hindered more than helped. The man's analysis of early villain encounters read like a preview of modern problems. Heroes were charging in without properly thinking things through. Villains were exploiting the gap between the timing of the hero's response and police coordination. Civilian casualties could have been prevented with better communication systems. The same mistakes were repeated across decades because the fundamental structure hadn't changed. We have replaced careful planning with raw power, the author wrote in what must have been a controversial statement at the time. And while power has its place, it cannot substitute for strategic thinking. A well-coordinated team of baseline humans with proper planning can often resolve situations more efficiently than a team of powerful heroes acting on limited information. The words felt like pure vindication and challenge combined. Here was proof that someone else had seen the problems Izuku observed, had documented them, and had tried to address them. But his papers were almost a century old, yellowed with age, and apparently his warnings had gone unheeded. The tactical journals provided a different perspective. They were dense technical analyses of specific operations, filled with terminology Izuku had to look up every few paragraphs. But gradually, a picture emerged of the complex machinery that operated behind every hero intervention. There were dispatch coordinators who processed emergency calls and deployed heroes based on quirk compatibility and threat assessment. Intelligence analysts who built profiles of villain organizations and predicted their next moves. Equipment specialists who designed tools to enhance or compensate for specific quirk limitations. Medical teams trained in treating injuries from hundreds of different quirk types. Each role required specialized knowledge, but none of them, at least in theory, required a quirk. Izuku's notebook filled rapidly with observations, questions, and connections. He drew diagrams showing the flow of information during a crisis, mapping out where delays and miscommunications typically occurred. He listed the skills required for each support role, noting which ones he already possessed and which he'd need to develop. The international comparison study revealed even more possibilities. In America, support staff were embedded directly with hero teams, participating in planning and decision-making as equals rather than subordinates. The European Union had developed a hybrid model where some support specialists could earn limited field certifications, allowing them to participate in operations within carefully defined parameters. South Korea had taken the most radical approach, creating an entirely separate track for so-called tactical coordinators, also called TCs. Individuals who directed hero operations from mobile command centers, using real-time data and strategic analysis to guide field operatives. These coordinators didn't need quirks, they needed sharp minds, quick decision-making abilities, and a comprehensive understanding of both quirks and criminals. The Korean model has shown a 34% improvement in operation success rates and a 41% reduction in civilian casualties compared to traditional hero-centric approaches, the study noted. However, implementation in other countries has met resistance from established hero agencies who view it as a challenge to their autonomy. Of course, there was resistance. Heroes who'd trained their entire lives to be self-sufficient warriors wouldn't easily accept direction from someone they saw as inferior, someone without a quirk, without the power to back up their decisions with force. The social dynamics were as much a barrier as the practical ones, like how? "Excuse me." The voice startled Izuku from his reading. He looked up to find a man in a rumpled trench coat standing beside his table, holding a stack of files and looking apologetic. The man was unremarkable at first glance. Average height, average build, the kind of face that would blend into any crowd. But something about his eyes, the way they took in the spread of materials on Izuku's table with quick, cataloging glances, suggested something else. "Don't stare," Izuku told himself, but his mind was already cataloging details automatically. The coat was well made despite its wrinkled state, made of expensive fabric that suggested either a good salary or careful shopping. The files he held were official-looking, with the kind of tabs and organization that spoke of a really careful organization. And those hands, steady, precise, the hands of someone who worked with delicate evidence and important documents. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man continued quietly, gesturing to the empty chair across from Izuku. "But would you mind if I shared your table? The others are all occupied, and I have some rather extensive research to do." Izuku glanced around, surprised to find the archive section had filled while he'd been absorbed in reading. Several researchers hunched over their own materials, the quiet rustle of turning pages creating a subtle symphony. "Oh, of course. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was taking up so much space." He apologized, trying to keep his voice down as he quickly began consolidating his materials, stacking notebooks and pulling books closer to his side of the table. "No need to apologize. I can see you're conducting serious research." The man settled into the chair with a grateful sigh, placing his files down with careful precision. "Those are definitely official documents," Izuku noted, trying not to crane his neck to see the letterheads. "Hero support systems, if I'm not mistaken? I've read some of those before. That's quite an unusual topic for someone your age." Heat crept up Izuku's neck. Even here, in a place dedicated to learning, his age marked him as an oddity. I'm interested in the analytical side of hero work. The more strategic planning and coordination that happens behind the scenes." His voice got quieter as he got more embarrassed. The man pulled out a pair of reading glasses, perching them on his nose as he opened his first file. "It's a worthwhile pursuit. Too many people focus on the flash and spectacle without appreciating the infrastructure that makes it all possible. Something in the way he said it, casual but knowing, made Izuku study him more carefully. The files he'd brought were clearly official documents of some kind, with stamps and classification markings that suggested government or law enforcement origin. The man's clothes, while rumpled, were well made as he had previously mentioned. And there was something about his posture, a kind of alert relaxation that Izuku associated with trained professionals. Police? The thought made his heart rate spike slightly. Or maybe someone from a hero agency administration. Someone who actually works in the field I'm researching? Are you in hero support work? Izuku hesitantly asked, curiosity overcoming his usual social anxiety. The man looked up from his files, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In a manner of speaking, I'm a detective with the Mizudafu police force. Name's Tsukachi Naomesa. He extended his hand across the table. Izuku's world tilted slightly. Detective Tsukachi Naomesa. The detective Tsukachi Naomesa. The name hit him like a physical impact, years of research and admiration crystallizing into the moment of meeting his subject in person. He'd never seen a picture of the man. Don't fanboy out, he commanded himself desperately, even as his mind raced through everything he knew about the man sitting across from him. The toxic chain investigation. The Vervidian incident. The trafficking ring that took 3 months of deep cover work to crack. The detective who works with All Might actually works with him, not just gets in the way. The one with the human lie detector quirk, but that's not why he's successful, it's his methodology, the systematic approach, the way he builds cases piece by piece until they're unshakable. Midoriya Izuku, he managed, shaking the offered hand and trying to keep his voice steady. Play it cool. Don't let him know you've read literally every public case file he's ever been associated with. I've read about some of your cases. Some of your cases. As if he hadn't spent hours analyzing the detective's investigative techniques, as if he didn't have QA whole-fledged notebook dedicated to breaking down the detective's methods, as if he hadn't written what could amount to something similar to academic papers on the man's approaches. The toxic chain investigation was particularly impressive, he continued, fighting to keep his tone casual despite the way his hands wanted to gesture excitedly. Worse of all, he had to keep in mind to keep his voice down. The way you connected the seemingly random attacks to a single supplier through chemical analysis of the restraints. It was amazing. Don't mention the shipping manifests. Don't bring up the interview techniques he used with the warehouse manager. Don't ask about the quirk analysis that let him predict the villain's next target. Be normal. For once. Tsukachi's eyebrows rose slightly. Thank you. You've done your homework. Most people only remember the cases where All Might makes dramatic arrests, The investigative work tends to get overlooked. I'm surprised you've heard of me. That's because they don't understand what they're looking at. Izuku's inner fanboy screamed. They see the flashy ending and miss the brilliant detective work that made it possible. They don't realize that you were the one who identified patterns weeks before the final confrontations, that you set up the entire operation that let All Might appear at exactly the right moment. But the investigative work is what makes those arrests possible, isn't it? Izuku said, leaning forward slightly despite himself. For example, in the toxic chain case, All Might is an amazing hero, but he only knew where to go because you'd identified the warehouse through shipping manifests and chemical trace analysis. Without that kind of planning, the villain would have kept operating. The words came out more intensely than he'd intended, and he caught himself before he could launch into a detailed breakdown of the case timeline. Dial it back. He doesn't need to know you've memorized the entire investigation. True. Tsukachi gave him a small smile as he studied him with those sharp eyes, the same ones that spotted the inconsistency in the Phantom Thief case, the ones that kept seeing patterns everyone else missed, seeming to reassess his initial impression. Though I notice you didn't mention my quirk. Most people assume that's what makes me effective as a detective. Because your quirk isn't the most impressive part. It's truly amazing, I could rant about it for hours, but you don't rely solely on it. Izuku's thoughts raced. Human lie detector is useful for interrogations, but it doesn't analyze crime scenes, build profiles, or recognize patterns in seemingly unrelated events. Those are skills, not supernatural abilities. That's what makes you brilliant. Why? Your quirk helps with interrogations, that's true, Izuku said before he could stop, but it doesn't solve cases. It can't analyze evidence or recognize a pattern. Those are skills. Like the way you identified the emotional triggers that let you crack the confession in the Umbrella Corporation case. Or how you recognized that the Blue Fire incidents weren't random arson but a systematic campaign to cover financial fraud. Gosh, he should stop talking. A refreshingly pragmatic perspective. Truly, thank you. Tsukachi smiled as he adjusted his glasses, returning his attention to his own files. Don't stare, Izuku told himself, but he couldn't help noticing the way the detective organized his documents. Chronological on the left, evidence photographs in the center, analytical handwritten notes on the right. It was systematic, efficient, the kind of approach that turned the chaos of his line of work into comprehensible patterns. He tried to go back into reading his own files to stop himself from embarrassing himself even more, but the man's voice pulled him back. May I ask what prompted your research into support roles? Tsukachi continued, his tone casual but his pen poised over his notepad in a way that suggested a more professional interest. It's not exactly a common interest, even those interested in hero work. The question felt like a test, though Izuku couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way Tsukachi asked it, casual but attentive, or the way his pen rested against his notepad as if ready to record the answer. He's profiling me, Izuku realized with a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and terror. Actually profiling me, the way he does with suspects and witnesses. I'm quirkless, Izuku said, the words coming out steadier than usual. But I've been analyzing hero work for years. I want to find a way to contribute, even if I can't be a traditional hero. He expected the usual reaction, as in pity, awkwardness, maybe well-meaning but ultimately hollow encouragement. Instead, Tsukachi simply nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable response. No pity face. No awkward pause. Acceptance? Analytical work might very well suit you then, Tsukachi said, and Izuku's heart skipped at the validation coming from someone whose own works he'd studied obsessively. It requires a particular kind of mind, one that can see patterns others miss, that questions assumptions, that doesn't accept easy answers. He's describing his own methods, Izuku realized. The approach he used in the Mirror Master case, where everyone assumed the theft was impossible until he proved the victim was actually the perpetrator. Or the way he questioned the obvious suspect in the Riverside murders until he found the real killer. Tsukachi pulled out one of his files, spreading several photographs across his side of the table. For instance, what do you see here? The test. He's actually testing me. Izuku's pulse quickened as he leaned forward to examine the photos. Detective Tsukachi Naomasa is testing my analytical skills. Don't mess this up. It was a cold case that had been marked as incomplete years ago. The photos showed what appeared to be a break-in scene. A smashed window, scattered glass, overturned furniture. Classic signs of forced entry and struggle. But Izuku found himself automatically applying the systematic approach he'd learned from studying Tsukachi's own methods. Look at the evidence without assumptions, question the obvious interpretation, find the details that didn't fit the expected pattern. Make his own ideas. The glass, he said slowly, forcing himself to be methodical rather than rushing to conclusions the way he did in his notebooks. It spread wrong. If someone broke in from outside, most of it should be inside the room. But there's too much outside the window. He studied the furniture placement, trying to think the way Tsukachi would think. What story does the evidence actually tell, not what it appears to tell? And the overturned chair. It fell toward the window, not away from it. As if someone was moving toward the exit when it got knocked over, which would explain the glass. Like the detail that cracked the Artisan Bank case, the muddy footprints were heading out of the vault, not into it. This probably wasn't a break-in, like the files say, Izuku concluded, the pieces clicking together with satisfying precision. It was staged to look like one. Someone broke the window from the inside, probably after whatever really happened. They wanted to make it look like forced entry to hide. What? Theft by someone who had legitimate access, maybe. Please let me be right, Please let me impress Detective Tsukachi, even a just little bit. Close. Tsukachi gathered the photos back with what might have been approval in his expression. I suspect an insurance fraud, actually. I'm looking into this cold case because it might relate to a current one my peers and I are working on. The store owner most likely staged a robbery to claim damages. But you identified the key inconsistencies without any context or case knowledge. That's not a skill that can be taught easily, it's a way of seeing. Pride flooded through Izuku so intensely that he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from bouncing in his seat. Detective Tsukachi said I have a way of seeing. He tested me and I passed. I actually impressed him. But seeing isn't enough, is it? Izuku said, forcing himself back to reality despite his internal celebration. I can analyze all I want, but without authority, without a position that gives my analysis weight. True. Tsukachi agreed, not sugarcoating the reality. Which is why most analytical roles require formal education and certification. Police academy for detective work, university degrees for intelligence analysis, and technical training for support equipment designs. The pathways exist, but they're not shortcuts. The weight of that truth settled on Izuku's shoulders, tempering his excitement with practical concerns. More years of school, specialized training, working his way up through systems that might not value his insights until he'd proven himself through traditional channels. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't the direct path to helping people he'd hoped for. However, Tsukachi continued, and Izuku's attention snapped back to him with laser focus. Exceptional analysis sometimes opens unexpected doors. He's going to give me advice. Detective Tsukachi is going to give me actual career advice. Holy shit. The detective pulled out a business card, holding it for a moment before placing it on the table between them. I can't make promises, but if you're serious about this path, stay in touch. The force occasionally uses civilian consultants for specialized analysis. It's rare and usually requires demonstrated expertise, but... He shrugged. You wouldn't be the first young person to prove that age doesn't always correlate with capability. Izuku stared at the card as if it might disappear if he looked away. Detective Tsukachi Naomesa's business card. His actual contact information. He wants me to stay in touch. What did he see in me in this tiny conversation? Thank you, this is an honor, he managed, accepting the card with hands that trembled slightly. Don't gush. Don't tell him he's your favorite non-hero professional. Be normal. I won't waste your time unless I have something genuinely valuable to contribute. See that you don't, Tsukachi said with a slight smile that took the sting out of the words. But also don't underestimate what constitutes valuable. Fresh perspectives can be just as important as expertise sometimes. They settled into companionable silence after that, Tsukachi reviewing his cold case files while Izuku dove back into the support system research. But Izuku found his attention constantly drifting to the detective and the way he cross-referenced documents, built timelines, and annotated photographs with tiny observations. This is how he works, Izuku observed, trying to memorize every detail without being obvious about it. This is the actual process behind all those brilliant investigations I've studied. It was systematic, almost scientific in its approach. Each piece of evidence was examined individually, then in relation to others, building a web of connections that gradually revealed the truth. It reminded Izuku of his own analytical process, but refined, professional, directed toward a specific purpose. He's not just reading those files, Izuku noticed. He's building some kind of framework, connecting details across different cases. Is this how he identifies patterns that others miss? The detective's notes were too far away to read without being obvious, but Izuku could see the structure: dates, names, locations organized in precise columns, with lines drawn between related elements. It was like watching a master craftsman work. I could watch him do this all day, Izuku admitted to himself. This is what professional analysis actually looks like, not just the theoretical frameworks I've been reading about. After what felt like both forever and no time at all, Tsukachi stood to leave, gathering his files with the same precision he'd displayed throughout his work. One more thing, Midoriya-kun, he said, pausing beside the table. The fact that he remembered Izuku's name sent another thrill through him. Detective Tsukachi remembered my name. That research you're doing, don't just study the successes. The real lessons come from understanding why support systems fail. What gaps exist? What assumptions do they make? What perspectives do they miss? He's giving me investigative methodology advice. Actual professional guidance from Detective Tsukachi. Holy shit. Why do heroes consistently make the same strategic mistakes? Izuku murmured, remembering his fundamental question. Exactly. Tsukachi's smile was sharp with approval, and Izuku felt like he'd just aced the most important test of his life. And more importantly, who notices those mistakes but lacks the power to correct them? Sometimes the most valuable insights come from the margins, from people the system overlooks. Have a great day, Midoriya-kun. With that, he left, leaving Izuku with more questions than answers but also with a strange sense of validation. A professional detective, the Detective Tsukachi, had taken his research seriously, had engaged with him as an equal rather than dismissing him as a quirkless kid with unrealistic dreams. And he gave me his business card, Izuku thought, staring at the small rectangle of cardstock like it was made of gold. He actually wants me to stay in touch. He thinks I might have something valuable to contribute someday. The encounter energized his research beyond anything caffeine could have ever achieved. He attacked the remaining materials with renewed focus, particularly the principal Nizu papers that Sato-san had photocopied for him, but now with a different lens. Not just academic curiosity, but the practical perspective someone like Detective Tsukachi might bring to these theoretical frameworks. If Tsukachi-sama were reading these papers, what would he focus on? What patterns would he identify that I might be missing? The first paper, Pattern Recognition in Crisis Management, read like a manifesto disguised as academic analysis. Nizu, writing as Muse, dissected several famous hero operations that had happened at the time this was written, showing how biases and institutional blindness had led to less than great outcomes. The tendency to view each villain encounter as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern represents a fundamental failure of strategic thinking, one passage argued. Heroes are trained to respond to immediate threats, but this reactive posture prevents them from recognizing and addressing more systematic problems. This is just like the way Tsukachi connected those seemingly random attacks in the toxic chain case, Izuku realized. He saw the pattern that everyone else missed because he was looking at the big picture, not just individual incidents. It was also exactly what Izuku had been observing with Smokescreen. Each encounter was treated as a separate event rather than part of a deliberate campaign. Nizu's paper, written 15 years ago, could have been describing yesterday's news. But now he had a frame of reference. He'd seen how a professional investigator actually identified patterns, how analysis could reveal connections that weren't obvious on the surface. Tsukachi would probably approach the Smokescreen problem the same way he approached Toxic Chain. Map out all the encounters, look for commonalities, and identify the underlying strategy. The second paper went deeper, exploring the psychological factors that prevented heroes from adapting their strategies. Success reinforces existing methods, even when those methods are suboptimal. A hero who defeats villains through brute force will continue using brute force, even when subtlety would be more effective. The quirk system exacerbates this by encouraging heroes to specialize in their natural abilities rather than developing complementary skills. And that's where someone like Tsukachi-sama becomes invaluable, Izuku thought. He's not limited by a quirk-based approach. He can adapt his methods to whatever the situation requires. Izuku highlighted passage after passage, feeling like he'd found a kindred spirit in these academic pages. Nizu saw the same problems, the same patterns, the same systemic failures that Izuku had been documenting in his notebooks. But more importantly, he was analyzing them with the same kind of systematic approach that had impressed him in Tsukachi's work. And better yet, he was Yuei's principal. He has the power to apply his ideas. But the third paper was the revelation. The integration problem, why hero society resists analytical support, laid out in devastating detail, the social and institutional barriers that prevented people like Izuku from contributing to hero work. And reading it now, after his encounter with Tsukachi, gave him new insight into both the problems and potential solutions. The elevation of quirks as the primary criterion for heroism has created a caste system that actively excludes potentially valuable contributors. Intelligence, strategic thinking, and analytical capability are treated as secondary qualities, useful but not essential. This prejudice is so deeply embedded that even those who would benefit from analytical support often reject it, viewing it as an admission of weakness or inadequacy. But Tsukachi doesn't think that way, Izuku realized. He values analytical thinking precisely because he understands its power. That's why he was willing to test me, to engage with my ideas seriously. The paper went on to describe attempts to integrate analytical specialists into hero agencies, most of which had failed due to resistance from established heroes who saw it as undermining their authority. The few successes came from agencies led by heroes who themselves possessed analytical quirks, like Sir Night Eye, and therefore valued intellectual contributions. Or heroes who work with analysts like Tsukachi and understand their value, Izuku added mentally. All might trust Tsukachi's analysis because he's seen the results. The solution is not to force integration but to demonstrate value through undeniable results. Analytical support must prove itself so effective that rejecting it becomes a competitive disadvantage. This requires not just capability but strategic positioning, finding the right opportunities, the right partners, the right moments to show what systematic analysis can achieve. Izuku read the conclusion 3 whole times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning. Nizu wasn't just describing the problem, he was outlining a strategy for overcoming it. Work from the margins, prove your value through results, and find allies who recognize the importance of intelligence over pure power. Like Tsukachi-sama, he thought, touching the business card in his pocket. He's exactly the kind of ally Nizu is talking about. Someone who understands that analysis and intelligence can be as powerful as any quirk. It was a long game, requiring patience and strategic thinking. But it was a game that could be won, especially if you had the right connections and mentors to guide you. And the determination, of course. And I just met one of the best analytical minds in the country. Izuku realized the full impact of his encounter finally hitting him. Detective Tsukachi actually gave me his contact information. He wants me to stay in touch. That's not nothing. The library had filled with the usual Saturday crowd by the time Izuku began packing up his materials. Families with young children in the picture book section, students cramming for exams, elderly patrons reading newspapers in comfortable chairs. The normal rhythm of a community engaging with knowledge. But for Izuku, the library had transformed into something else. An even bigger treasure box of possibilities, a map to futures he hadn't acknowledged existed, and the place where he'd met someone whose work he'd admired for years. I actually talked to Detective Tsukachi, he thought, still slightly in disbelief. I showed him my analytical skills, and he seemed impressed, or at least satisfied. He said I have a way of seeing, and gave me his business card and told me to stay in touch. His notebook now contained not just observations but action items. Skills to develop, statistical analysis, criminal psychology, pattern recognition software, multiple languages, since villain organizations were increasingly becoming international. Credentials to pursue, university degree in criminology or strategic studies, possible police academy training, certifications in specific analytical methods. Resources to explore, professional journals on intelligence analysis, case studies of successful civilian consultants, networks of quirkless individuals in adjacent fields who might share advice and opportunities. And now, potentially, guidance from an actual professional detective who'd taken him seriously. It was very overwhelming but also exhilarating. For the first time, he had not just a concrete path forward but also a connection to someone already walking that path successfully. As he headed toward the exit, Sato called him over to the reference desk. "Find what you were looking for?" "More than I expected," Izuku admitted. "So much more. Thank you for your help. The Nizu papers, especially, they're exactly what I needed to read." She studied him with the particular intuition of someone who'd watched countless young people struggle with difficult questions. "You know, Principal Nizu occasionally gives public lectures at UA. They're technically for university-level students and professionals, but they're open to anyone who registers in advance. The next one is in 3 weeks. Izuku's breath caught. A chance to hear Principal Nizu speak in person, to see how that brilliant analytical mind worked in real time? After reading his papers, after understanding the depth of his strategic thinking? How do I register? Sato smiled and pulled out a flyer from beneath the desk. I had a feeling you might be interested. The registration is online, but spaces fill quickly. You'll want to apply today. He accepted the flyer with gratitude that went beyond words. Another door opening, another possibility emerging from what had seemed like a dead end just yesterday. And Detective Tsukachi said to stay in touch. He reminded himself, touching the business card again. Maybe someday I could actually contribute to one of his investigations. Maybe I could be the kind of analyst he'd want to consult with. The thought was almost too exciting to contemplate seriously. The walk home took him through downtown Mizudafu, past the site of yesterday's encounter between Flame Wing and Smokescreen. The intersection had been cleaned up, the broken glass swept away, life returning to normal as if nothing had happened. But Izuku could still see some remnants, like the smoke residue on certain buildings showing where Smokescreen had concentrated his quirk, the construction site that had been the real target, the security camera angles that would have captured everything if anyone bothered to analyze the footage properly. What would Tsukachi do with this scene? Izuku wondered, stopping to examine the area with new eyes. He'd probably start by mapping the smoke patterns, identifying the best exit points, and analyzing the timing of the hero's response versus the villain's objectives. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Smokescreen spotted in industrial district, heroes responding. He grimaced. Another encounter, another test, another set of data for the villain to collect while the heroes involved repeated the same mistakes. And worse, the attacks seemed to be happening even more now. The last one had been yesterday, for gosh sake. The man must be getting more confident in his ways. But now, Izuku found himself thinking about it differently, not just as a frustrated observer but as someone who might someday have the tools and position to do something about it. If I were analyzing this for Detective Tsukachi, what would I focus on? The thought felt presumptuous but also thrilling. Pattern analysis. Geographic distribution of incidents. Timing correlations. Resource requirements for each attack. He pulled out a notepad and started writing as he walked, but now his analysis had a structure borrowed from what he'd observed of Tsukachi's methodology hours before. Categories for different types of evidence. Cross-references between incidents. Questions that built on each other systematically rather than randomly. Date and time of each encounter. Location and target significance. Heroes who responded and their quirk limitations versus Smokescreen strategy. Civilian casualties and property damage. Duration of engagement. Method of escape. It was still the same analytical drive that had always consumed him, but now it felt less like an obsessive hobby and more like preparation. Training for the kind of work he might actually do someday. Back in his apartment, Izuku spread his new materials across his desk, organizing them into categories: immediate learning opportunities, long-term educational goals, networking possibilities, and practical skill development. But now he had a fourth category: professional connections. Detective Tsukachi's business card occupied the place of honor on his bulletin board, right next to the Principal Nizu lecture registration information. 2 actual professionals who had taken him seriously, who might, someday, if he proved himself, be willing to guide his development. I could actually do this, he realized with a mixture of excitement and terror. Not just dream about contributing to hero work, but actually build the skills and connections to make it happen. The Principal Nizu lecture registration went through immediately. Apparently, not many teenagers were interested in academic discussions of this sort on a Saturday afternoon. But Izuku felt like he'd just won the lottery. 3 weeks to prepare, to formulate intelligent questions, to make the most of an opportunity to interact with one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the country. What would I ask him if I had the chance? The question consumed him as he organized his research materials. How do you identify which assumptions are worth questioning? What's the most effective way to demonstrate analytical value to people who are skeptical of non-quirk contributions? How do you maintain objectivity when analyzing systems you're personally invested in changing? But it was Detective Tsukachi's business card that really captured his imagination. The detective had said to stay in touch, but what did that actually mean? When would be appropriate to make contact? What kind of analysis would be worth sharing? Should he even share things if the detective hadn't personally requested? He said exceptional analysis sometimes opens unexpected doors, Izuku remembered. He was talking about civilian consultants, about demonstrated expertise. What if I could actually develop something worth consulting about? The smokescreen case seemed like the obvious choice. A current, ongoing investigation where traditional hero approaches were consistently failing. If Izuku could develop a comprehensive analysis, not just observations but actionable plans, maybe that would be worth sharing. But I'd have to be sure it was actually valuable, he warned himself. Tsukachi is a professional. He doesn't have time for amateur theories or half-baked ideas. Whatever I develop would have to be rigorous, systematic, and actually useful. The challenge excited rather than daunted him. For the first time, his obsessions had a concrete goal beyond his own curiosity. He pulled out his fresh notebook, which he had inaugurated yesterday, his collection was growing rapidly, and began outlining a comprehensive analysis framework for the smokescreen case. Not the scattered observations he'd been making, but a systematic investigation using principles borrowed from what he saw today of Tsukachi's methodology and structured according to the academic approaches he'd learned from the research materials. Timeline analysis: map every known encounter chronologically, looking for patterns in timing, location, and strategic objectives. Geographic analysis: plot incident locations against city infrastructure, identifying the tactical significance of each site. Behavioral analysis: examine smokescreen's evolution across encounters. What's he learning? How is his strategy adapting? Response analysis: document hero deployment patterns, identify systematic weaknesses being exploited. Predictive modeling: based on established patterns, where and when is the next encounter likely to occur? It was ambitious, maybe impossibly so for a teenager with limited resources and no official access to case files. But every professional investigation started with ambitious goals and systematic methodology, right? Plus, I have advantages the official investigators might not have, Izuku realized. I've been tracking this case from the beginning. I don't have limitations or bureaucratic constraints. I can look at patterns across multiple agencies and time PRDS. The work stretched late into the night, but it felt different from his usual late-night analysis sessions. Instead of the frantic energy of obsession, he felt the focused determination of purpose. He was building something that might actually matter, that might someday catch the attention of someone like Detective Tsukachi. Timeline analysis first, he decided, spreading out papers across his desk. Start with what's concrete and documented, then build outward to inference and prediction. He began with the first confirmed smokescreen sighting 6 months ago, a seemingly minor incident at an electronics warehouse that had been dismissed as standard villain activity. But looking at it now, patterns emerged that hadn't been obvious at the time. The warehouse specialized in communication equipment. The timing coincided with a major hero agency upgrading its dispatch systems. Smokescreen's escape route took him directly past 3 other potential targets, but he didn't engage with any of them. Hypothesis: the attack wasn't about theft but intelligence gathering. He was testing response times, communication protocols, and hero deployment patterns. Each next incident fit the pattern when examined carefully. Not random criminal activity, but systematic intelligence gathering disguised as ordinary villainy. Smokescreen was studying the heroes, learning their weaknesses, preparing for something larger, just like he'd suspected the day before. This is exactly what Tsukachi would look for, Izuku thought excitedly. The underlying pattern that explains seemingly disconnected events. The strategic thinking that everyone else might be missing. By 2 a.m. he had filled 25 pages of his brand not-so-new notebook with analysis, cross-references, and conclusions. The geographic pattern was particularly revealing. Smokescreen's incidents formed a rough circle around the city's central hero dispatch center, each attack probing a different aspect of the response system. He's mapping their capabilities, Izuku realized. Testing response times from different districts, identifying which heroes respond to which types of incidents, learning how they coordinate with each other and with the police. It was brilliant in a terrifying way. While heroes treated each encounter as an isolated incident, Smokescreen was conducting a gigantic operation, gathering data for some future campaign that would exploit every weakness he'd identified. The analysis was far from complete, but it already revealed insights that weren't apparent from individual incident reports. This was the kind of pattern recognition that he had just learned about, the systematic thinking that could transform scattered observations into something concrete. Is this good enough to share, once I'm done? Izuku wondered, staring at his pages of notes and diagrams. Would Detective Tsukachi consider this valuable, or would he see it as speculation? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but underneath it was a growing confidence. He'd applied professional methodology to a real case and discovered patterns that weren't obvious from surface analysis. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was the kind of work that might catch the attention of someone who valued this way of thinking. I need to develop this further, he decided. More data, statistics, predictive models. If I'm going to contact Detective Tsukachi, I want to have something that demonstrates my real capability. But still, the foundation was there. For the first time, his analytical obsessions had produced something that might have actual professional value. The thought energized him despite his exhaustion. 3 weeks until Nisa's lecture. Enough time to refine this analysis, maybe develop preliminary predictions that could be tested against future incidents. And if those predictions prove accurate, the possibility was almost too exciting to take seriously. Real analytical work that could prevent villain successes, protect civilians, and help heroes operate more effectively. The kind of contribution that might earn recognition from professionals. His mother knocked gently on his door. Izuku? It's very late, sweetheart. Just finishing up, Mom, he called back, but he made no move to put away his materials. The analysis was calling to him, patterns demanding exploration, connections waiting to be discovered. Just a little more, he promised himself. Just enough to test one more hypothesis. But hours later, he was still working, driven by the intoxicating possibility that his analytical mind might finally have found its proper application. Outside his window, the city slept peacefully, unaware that somewhere in the darkness, a villain was likely planning his next intelligence-gathering mission. But in his small apartment, surrounded by endless papers and websites, Izuku worked toward the day when his analysis might help catch that villain and protect those innocent people. The background research phase was ending, but it had accomplished more than just gathering information. It had connected him with potential professionals who might see what he can do, revealed concrete paths forward, and given him the theoretical framework to transform his obsessions into a future. Tomorrow, later today, actually, he would begin the development of his analytical skills, the careful building of a body of work that might someday earn him a place in the professional community. It would take years to achieve the level of expertise needed to be taken seriously. But every expert started as a beginner, every authority was once dismissed as inexperienced. And now he had a concrete start for the journey, connections to guide him, and actual evidence that his mind worked in ways that professionals might value. The research part was done. He'd virtually looked at every website, PDF, news articles, and everything he could. Now it was time to prove that a quirkless kid with a notebook and too many questions could actually contribute to keeping people safe. The past 3 weeks had been a special kind of hell. Izuku hunched deeper into his uniform blazer as he walked through UA's gates, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. The prestigious school's campus sprawled before him like something from a dream. After all, the gleaming glass and modern architecture really did make this place seem like something no human could possibly construct. A group of students in their crisp uniforms moved in clusters, their animated conversations about quirk training creating a buzz of excitement that made Izuku's stomach twist with familiar longing. He didn't belong here. The guest lecture registration had been open to the public, sure, but that didn't make him any less of an outsider. It had already been 3 weeks since his encounter with Detective Tsukachi at the library, and those 3 weeks had been a masterclass in why hope was a dangerous thing for someone like him. It started the Monday after his library research session. Izuku had made the mistake of being visibly excited, even though he was by himself, as usual, about something during lunch break. He had been hunched over one of his notebooks, writing with a visibly rejuvenated kind of focus that his classmates had learned to recognize as a warning sign. His enthusiasm had been infectious in the worst possible way. It had drawn attention. "What's got Deku so worked up now? Stop muttering." Bakuga's voice had cut across the classroom like a blade, and Izuku had felt his stomach drop even before he looked up to see the boy approaching with a familiar predatory gleam in his eyes. It's nothing," Izuku had said, trying to close his notebook casually. But casual was a foreign concept when Bakuga was involved, and his attempt at discretion had only made things worse. "Nothing? You've been scribbling like a maniac for the past 10 minutes, huh? Even more than your usual." Bakuga had snatched the notebook before Izuku could stop him, holding it high enough that Izuku's attempts to retrieve it were useless. "Let's see what kind of delusions you're working on now." The silence that followed had been the worst part. Not the laughter that came later, but the moment of absolute quiet as Bakuga read pages of tactical analysis, resource constraint mapping, and behavioral pattern documentation with growing disbelief. "Holy shit," Bakuga had said finally, his voice carrying across the classroom with perfect acoustic efficiency. "Deku thinks he's going to play analyst. What a joke." The words had hit the classroom like a declaration of war. Within seconds, 23 pairs of eyes were focused on Izuku with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly fascinating train wrecks. "What's that?" someone had asked, and Bakuga's grin had turned razor-sharp. "It's what losers do when they can't accept reality," he'd announced, flipping through pages with theatrical flourishes. "Look at this sheet. He's got diagrams and graphs and FANG timelines about villain attacks. As if anyone would pay a quirkless nobody to tell real heroes how to do their goddamn jobs." The laughter had been immediate and sharp, cutting through any pretense that his research might be taken seriously by anyone his own age. Izuku had sat there, watching his classmates pass his notebook around like evidence of mental illness, pointing at his careful analysis and making jokes about his delusions of grandeur. "Maybe Deku can be All Might's personal advisor," someone said sarcastically, which had prompted another wave of laughter. "Yeah, I'm sure he'd love to hear about quirk theory from someone who doesn't have one," another classmate had added, and the comment had landed with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to twist the knife. Even the teacher, when he'd returned from the faculty meeting, had looked uncomfortable but hadn't intervened. That always happened, so Izuku wasn't particularly surprised. Mr. Hayashi had taken one look at the situation and had simply started the next lesson without comment. At least Mr. Hayashi was one of the better ones. Some would also openly mock him. He knew some lowered his grades so it would match his status. At least this one just stayed quiet. But the worst part hadn't been the immediate mockery. It had been the way it had continued, day after day, with the relentless persistence of water wearing away stone. "How's the hero consulting fuckery, Deku?" Bakuga would ask every morning, his voice carrying an absurd amount of sarcasm for someone awake at 7 a.m. "Have you written any reports for Endeavor lately?" Another classmate would chime in during lunch, and the comment would be followed by snickering that felt like insects crawling under Izuku's skin. The social isolation he experienced there was already quite bad, but it had become total in a way that even Izuku hadn't expected. Students who had previously ignored him now actively avoided him, as if his delusions might be contagious. Group projects became exercises in being grudgingly tolerated rather than being at least included for his smarts, which only some acknowledged. Even teachers seemed to look at him differently, with the kind of concerned pity usually reserved for students showing early signs of serious psychological problems. The worst incident had happened just last week, during career counseling day. Each student was supposed to meet with their homeroom teacher to discuss their post-graduation plans, and Izuku had made the catastrophic mistake of being honest. Hero support work. He'd told Mr. Hayashi when asked about his interests. Analysis, coordination, that kind of thing. The pause that had followed felt like falling off a cliff in slow motion. Mr. Hayashi had set down his pen and looked at Izuku with the expression of someone trying to figure out whether he was dealing with delusion or simple naivety. Midoriya-kun, the teacher had said carefully, hero roles, even if only in support, require extensive training or university education. Analysis positions typically require advanced degrees. These aren't entry-level career paths. I understand that, Izuku had replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm planning to pursue the necessary education. I've been conducting independent research to develop my skills, and I think I have the foundation to build on. Mr. Hayashi had picked up one of the forms from his desk, the standard career guidance worksheet that every student was required to complete. Your grades are good, which is commendable. It could be better in some classes, but still. We need to discuss realistic expectations. These roles are competitive, and preference is typically given to candidates with relevant quirks. Someone with a tactical analysis quirk, or enhanced pattern recognition, or cognitive acceleration abilities. The subtext had been clear: someone with a quirk. Someone who wasn't fundamentally lacking the most basic qualification for any career in the hero industry. What would you recommend instead? Izuku had asked, and the question had felt like surrender. Well, your attention to detail suggests you might excel in accounting. Or perhaps library science. You seem to enjoy research. There are also opportunities in technical writing, which values precision. Each suggestion had landed like a physical blow. Safe careers. Boring careers. Careers for people who had given up on their dreams and accepted the boundaries that society had drawn around their lives. Do consider those options, Izuku had said, because arguing would have been pointless and embarrassing for both of them. But the real damage had come later, when word of the career counseling session had somehow reached his classmates. Izuku had never figured out who had leaked the information. Maybe Mr. Hayashi had mentioned it to another teacher, maybe someone had overheard through the classroom's thin walls, but by the next day, everyone knew. I heard the quirkless kid is going to be an accountant, someone had announced during lunch, and the comment had been met with the kind of delighted laughter that suggested perfect comedic timing. Makes sense, Bakugo had added with his characteristic tone. Counting other people's money is about the right level for someone who can't do anything else. The comment had hurt worse than usual. Accounting, library science, they were fine careers, respectable careers, but they were also consolation prizes to some. Some thought they were what people did when what they really wanted was impossible. Izuku knew that all careers had their values and that it had been just plain rude to say that, but the comment still stung. Those doubts had made the next 3 weeks of research feel simultaneously vital and pointless. Every insight felt like it might be meaningless. Every connection he drew between seemingly unrelated points could just be coincidence that had been elevated to significance by his desperate need to be special, to matter, to have something valuable to contribute. The smokescreen analysis had grown to fill almost the entire notebooks, now cross-referenced and color-coded with details that came from having too much need to prove himself. Geographic patterns, temporal analysis, behavioral evolution, resource requirements, he'd approached the case from every angle he could think of, building what he hoped was a comprehensive picture of the villain's methodology. But was it actually good? Was it the kind of professional-level work that might impress someone like Principal Nizu, Detective Tsukachi, any professional? Or was it just the elaborate fantasy of a quirkless teenager who'd been trying too much? The uncertainty gnawed at him as he navigated UA's security checkpoint, which was unsurprisingly thorough: metal detectors, quirk suppressors, people had to sign an agreement form to those in the sign-up page, and guards whose sharp eyes catalogued every visitor with efficiency. When Izuku presented his registration confirmation, the security guard's expression shifted from neutral professionalism to poorly concealed confusion. Lecture Hall B7, the guard said, handing back Izuku's ID with the kind of polite disinterest reserved for people who clearly didn't matter. Follow the blue line on the floor. The lecture begins in 10 minutes. Izuku nodded his thanks and followed the indicated path, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the pristine corridors. The walls were lined with trophy cases and photographs of famous alumni, heroes whose names were known worldwide. All Might's portrait dominated one entire wall, his brilliant smile seeming to track Izuku's movement with impossible warmth. He had been a previous student here too, after all. You could have gone here, a treacherous part of his mind whispered. If you'd been born different, If you'd had a quirk, any quirk at all, you could have walked these halls as a student instead of a visitor. He pushed the thought away. Today was too important to waste on self-pity. The lecture hall was smaller than he'd expected but still impressive, with stadium seating that allowed every attendee a clear view of the stage. About 70 people were scattered throughout the space. He could see students with notebooks and laptops, older professionals in business attire, and a few individuals who had the unmistakable bearing of off-duty heroes. The average age appeared to be somewhere in the mid-20s to 30s, making Izuku feel embarrassingly young in his high school uniform. He chose a seat toward the back, settling into the cushioned chair with his notebook clutched against his chest like armor. The conversations around him were intimidating. He could hear graduate students discussing their known topics with casual expertise, professionals debating, some heroes silently sharing stories from their field. Maybe I should leave, he thought, watching a group of university students set up recording equipment with the confidence of people who belonged in academic spaces. This is for real academics, people who actually know what they're talking about. What am I doing here? But then the lights dimmed and Principal Nizu took the stage, and Izuku's doubts were temporarily forgotten. The principal of UA was not quite what Izuku had imagined from reading his papers and from seeing occasional pictures. He was small, remarkably so, a white-furred creature that looked more like a mouse or stoat than a human, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that somehow made him look both adorable and unsettling. But it was his eyes that caught Izuku's attention, bright, intelligent, and carrying a gleam that suggested he found something deeply amusing about the world at large. When Nizu smiled at the audience, Izuku felt a chill run down his spine. It was a polite smile, friendly even, but there was something predatory underneath it. Not malicious exactly, but the look of someone who saw 17 steps ahead in every conversation and found the gap in understanding delightful. "Good evening," Nizu began, his voice surprisingly rich and warm for someone of his stature. "Today's topic will be educational psychology in high-stress environments and how cognitive load theory applies to hero training," he said, pointing a laser to the projection he had on the walls. "But before we begin, I must warn you, his smile widened, showing just a hint of teeth, "I do so enjoy when my lectures challenge assumptions. Please feel free to disagree with me. It makes things so much more interesting." The last word carried a weight that made several audience members shift uncomfortably. Izuku found himself leaning forward despite his nervousness. Izuku knew this lecture might not really help him with his own studies. These meet and greets were organized in a way that the topic discussed was never openly divulged, he enrolled knowing. So, everyone came in blind. But then again, the people here weren't here to learn a specific topic. They were here to see the brilliant principal talk. Now, let me establish a fundamental premise that many of you might find uncomfortable. The human brain is remarkably bad at learning under stress. Yet hero work is defined by high-stress decision-making. This creates what I call a training paradox. We must prepare students for conditions that actively inhibit the learning process. Fascinating, isn't it? A hand shot up in the audience, a woman in her 30s wearing what looked like a teacher's badge. "Excuse me. With respect, Principal Nizu, isn't that just the nature of emergency response training? Police, firefighters, and military personnel all face the same challenge." "Oh, an excellent point." Nizu's eyes gleamed with what looked like genuine delight. Emergency response training does face similar challenges. But, and here's where it gets delicious, there's a crucial difference. He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him displayed a brain imaging scan. Most emergency responders have clearly defined protocols to follow under stress. Hero work, by its very nature, requires improvisation and creative problem-solving in situations that simply cannot be anticipated through training scenarios. We're not teaching students to follow a script, we're teaching them to write new scripts in real time while someone is actively trying to kill them. Doesn't that sound wonderfully inefficient? There was something unsettling about the way he said it, as if he found the entire system both absurd and amusing. Izuku found himself captivated despite his discomfort. "This is a neurological scan of a student during a standard written exam," Nizu continued, his tone shifting to something more clinical. Note the areas of activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for analytical thinking, pattern recognition, and complex decision-making. The next slide showed a dramatically different image. And this is the same student during a simulated villain encounter in our training facilities. The prefrontal cortex activity has decreased by nearly 60%, while limbic system activation, which is the fight or flight response, has increased proportionally. In more extreme words, the moment students need their brains the most, their brains essentially abandon them. Isn't biology cruel? The words were delivered with a cheerful tone that made them somehow more disturbing. Murmurs ran through the audience as people absorbed the implications. The implications are quite profound, Nizu said, pacing across the stage with his paws clasped behind his back. Under stress, students typically become less capable of using their own intelligence. They revert to more instinctive responses and rely on muscle memory. This is, in my opinion, why so many heroes develop tactics that emphasize raw power application over strategic thinking. He paused, his expression shifting to something that might have been sympathy if it weren't for the calculating gleam in his eyes. Of course, this presents a wonderful puzzle for someone like me. How do we design education systems that account for our students' brains working against them at the worst possible moments? The lecture continued for the next hour, exploring the cognitive mechanisms that influenced learning under pressure. Nizu discussed how different types of stress affected information processing, why traditional training methods often reinforced suboptimal decision-making patterns, and how educational environments could be restructured to promote better adaptation to high stress. Throughout it all, his DLVI was a masterclass in controlled chaos. He kept alternating between genuine academic insight, slightly sadistic observations about failures, and moments of what seemed like deliberate mischief. He would make a serious point, then follow it with a cheerful anecdote about a training exercise that had nearly hospitalized several students, but they learned so much from the experience. Izuku found himself filling pages with notes, not just about the academic content but about Nizu's methodology itself. The principal was teaching them about stress and learning while simultaneously putting them under mild stress through his unpredictable DLVY. It was manipulative, brilliant, and more than a little concerning. This brings us to a critical question. You may think about it as this lecture comes to a close. Nizu said, his smile widening in a way that suggested he'd been building toward this moment all along. If we truly have understood that stress does impair complex thinking, how do we design training that actually prepares students for the cognitive demands of real hero work? He paused, his bright eyes scanning the audience with predatory interest. More importantly, should we even try? Or should we perhaps acknowledge that some roles require minds that remain calm during chaos? That perhaps not everyone needs to be in the field to save lives? The question hung in the air with deliberate weight, and Izuku realized it connected directly to his own situation. If heroes struggled with complex thinking under stress, then support systems that could provide analytical insights in real time became invaluable. Remote coordinators who could process information without the limitations imposed by the immediate physical danger could potentially compensate for the constraints. When Nizu opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately throughout the audience. Graduate students posed theoretical challenges, educators asked about practical implementation in training programs, and some that looked like off-duty heroes inquired about techniques for maintaining analytical clarity under pressure. As the questions wound down, Izuku found himself hesitantly raising his own hand before he could stop himself. The motion was automatic, and he regretted it as soon as he did it. But before he could bring his arm down, Principal Nizu's sharp eyes found him in the back of the hall, and Izuku could have sworn the principal's smile shifted into something more genuinely interested. Yes, the young man in the school uniform. How delightful. We have a high school student attending an academic lecture. Please do share your thoughts. Every head in the hall turned toward him, and Izuku felt the familiar flush of embarrassment and espionage creep up his neck. But something about Nizu's tone made him push forward. His voice cracked slightly and he cleared his throat. He knew he would stutter, which brought yet another wave of embarrassment. Yes, sir, you mentioned that stress impairs pattern recognition and analytical thinking in field operatives. I was wondering. In situations where heroes consistently make the same strategic errors across multiple similar encounters, would that suggest that their training environment isn't providing adequate stress management? And if so, would external analytical support be more effective than trying to improve individual stress tolerance? The hall went quiet in a way that made Izuku's stomach clench. His question had been longer and much more detailed than he'd intended, delivered in the rapid-fire style that emerged when his enthusiasm, even with the stutter, overrode his social anxiety. Principal Nizu's expression had shifted during the question, his head tilting slightly in a gesture that somehow managed to look both curious and calculating. "Oh my," the principal said happily, and there was something delighted in his voice. "That's a very sophisticated synthesis of the material. Your question touches on several advanced concepts, in both cognitive psychology and organizational behavior." He stepped forward, his bright eyes fixed on Izuku with an intensity that felt like being examined by something far more dangerous than his cute appearance suggested. The boy couldn't help but shiver. The idea that external analytical support could compensate for stress-induced limitations is particularly interesting. "Tell me, young man, did you develop that connection during this lecture, or have you been thinking about these issues for some time?" It was a test, he could feel it in the way Nizu asked, in the sharp attention of those two intelligent eyes. The principal wasn't just asking about his thought process, he was evaluating something that he wasn't sure he even wanted to know what. "Thinking about it for a while, sir," Izuku admitted. "I've been studying hero-villain encounters independently, trying to understand why certain errors seem to recur across different heroes and situations." "Independently," Nizu repeated, and his smile widened slightly. "How wonderfully ambitious. And what, may I ask, prompted such unusual research interests for someone your age?" Why was the principal still laser-focused on him? He hadn't done any follow-up questions with the other attending people. Trying to deal with his own stress, he started to think. The question felt loaded with implications. Izuku could deflect, could give a safe answer, but something about Nizu's expression suggested that dishonesty would be immediately detected and far more problematic than the truth. "I've been trying to find ways to contribute to hero work without being in the active field," he said carefully. He expected the usual questions, the probing that would eventually lead to the uncomfortable admission. But Nizu simply tilted his head, studying Izuku with those two bright eyes. "I see," the principal said. "So you've concluded that analytical work might be your path forward?" Nizu continued, his smile widening slightly. "How interesting." The way he said it made it sound less like praise and more like he'd just discovered a fascinating puzzle to solve. Izuku internally prayed that he got out alive from this. "May I ask your name, young man?" "Midoriya Izuku, sir." "Well, Midoriya-kun, your question deserves a thorough answer." Nizu's tone shifted slightly, becoming more academic but retaining that edge of playful menace. "Yes, repeated strategic errors often indicate inadequate stress regulation. And yes, external analytical support can be highly effective, though heavy implementation still faces significant cultural barriers in hero work." He paused, still watching Izuku with that unsettling intensity. "But more importantly, your question reveals something fascinating. You're not asking whether analytical support could work, you're asking whether it would be more effective than current methods. That's a critical distinction. One suggests curiosity, the other suggests you've already conducted significant independent research and developed working hypotheses." "Fascinating," Nizu continued, and the word carried both approval and something that might have been concern. "Would you be interested in discussing your analytical approach in more detail after the lecture? I do so enjoy conversations with people who think unusually." It wasn't really a question. The way Nizu phrased it made clear that declining would be both rude and pointless. The principal had already decided this conversation would happen. "Why yes, sir," Izuku managed. "If you think it would be worthwhile." "Oh, I'm quite certain it will be very worthwhile. For both of us." The rest of the canned A session passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Izuku tried to focus on the other questions and answers, But his mind kept circling back to Principal Nizu's words and that unsettling smile that suggested he'd just walked into something far more complex than a simple academic discussion. As the audience began to disperse, Nizu made his way up the aisle with surprising speed for someone of his stature, moving with the efficient grace of a predator who'd spotted interesting prey. "Midoriya-kun," the principal said, settling into the seat beside him with an air of polite formality that somehow made the conversation feel both important and dangerously unpredictable. "I must admit, your question caught my attention in ways that university students' questions rarely do. The connection you've made between my own lecture and your own previous knowledge is seriously impressive, especially at your age. But it also suggests you've been thinking about these issues from multiple perspectives." The principal's smile grew slightly sharper. "So tell me, Midoriya-kun, how extensive has your independent research been? And more importantly, have you been conducting active analysis of ongoing situations?" The question hit Izuku like a bucket of ice water. Nizu knew. Somehow, from one question and a few sentences of conversation, the principal had deduced that Izuku wasn't just theorizing, he was actively analyzing real cases. Izuku's voice faltered. "I've been tracking patterns in hero-villain encounters, using publicly available information to develop analytical frameworks, of course. I'm working on a personal case study about systematic data collection by villains, and I'm trying to understand their methodology." Nizu's paws folded neatly in his lap, but his bright eyes never left Izuku's face. "Is that so? Then, let me be direct. Show me your analysis. Given your dedication, I'm sure you brought at least one notebook regarding this topic." It wasn't a request. Despite the polite phrasing, the tone made clear that refusal wasn't really an option. Izuku's hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a notebook from his backpack, the one containing his most recent smokescreen analysis. Watching Nizu examine his work felt like standing before a judge who could see that he wasn't fit for this. Still, the principal's examination was methodical and unsettlingly thorough. His small paws turned pages with delicate precision, his eyes scanning each diagram and notation with the kind of attention that suggested he was processing information at speeds Izuku could barely imagine. Nizu murmured occasionally, the sound carrying layers of meaning that Izuku couldn't decipher. "Interesting choice here. Clever cross-reference. Oh, that's a dangerous assumption." Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Nizu closed the notebook and looked up at Izuku. His expression was unreadable, though he wore a smile with sharp teeth. "This is remarkably comprehensive work," the principal said, enthusiastically. "Your methodology shows clear influences from multiple analytical frameworks. I'd say criminology, behavioral psychology, tactical analysis, at least these definitely played a role here. You've developed a very interesting systematic approach that most students here at UA would struggle to achieve." Izuku felt a flutter of hope, but it was immediately tempered by the "but" he could hear coming. However, Nizu continued, his tone shifting to something more cautious. "You're conducting independent analysis of what is an active criminal investigation. Using publicly available information, yes, but developing predictive models and strategic recommendations without proper oversight or authority." The principal's smile had faded into something more neutral, though his eyes still held that calculating and interested gleam. "Tell me, Midoriya-kun, do you understand why that might be problematic?" Yes, sir," Izuku admitted, his voice small. "I'm working with incomplete information and making assumptions about things I don't really have the authority or expertise to truly address. I know my analysis could be wrong, or could even interfere with official investigations if I ever acted on it. Also, if this were to fall into the wrong hands, it would cause serious trouble." "Good," Nizu said, and Izuku was surprised by the genuine approval in the word. He expected to be shunned. "You understand your current limitations. Many people don't. They conduct amateur analysis and convince themselves they've solved mysteries that trained professionals somehow missed." The principal leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "But here's what interests me. Despite those limitations, your analysis reveals genuine capability. You've identified patterns that aren't obvious from surface observation, and that some bad professionals might not notice. Your modeling is sophisticated, your geographic analysis is sound, and your predictions, while based on incomplete data, shows logical progression. Nizu paused, his head tilting slightly. You have talent, Midoriya-kun. Raw, undeveloped, unique, extraordinary, potentially dangerous talent. The question is, what should we do about it? The phrasing made Izuku nervous. We implied that Nizu had already decided to become involved somehow, and that this wasn't just a friendly academic discussion. How in the world did he catch the attention of a professional detective and the UA principal with a high-specs quirk? I've been trying to develop my skills responsibly, Izuku said, knowing how immature it sounded even as he spoke. Reading academic papers, studying methodology, trying to understand the ethical and practical constraints. Detective Tsukachi gave me a bit of guidance about systematic thinking, and I've been trying to apply it carefully. Tsukachi Neomesa? Nizu's ears perked up slightly. Oh, he and I are great comrades. You've been in contact with him? We met at the library a few weeks ago. He looked at some of my preliminary analysis and seemed not unimpressed. He gave me his business card and told me to stay in touch if I developed anything genuinely valuable. How wonderfully coincidental, Nizu said, and his smile returned with a mischievous edge. Or perhaps not coincidental at all. Detective Tsukachi has excellent judgment about talent, after all. The principal stood, smoothing his suit with precise movements. Midoriya-kun, I'm going to make you an offer, but I want you to understand something first. I am not being kind. I am not offering charity or pity to a quirkless student with analytical interests. I am offering this because your capabilities, if properly developed, could be genuinely valuable. And if left undeveloped, could be genuinely dangerous, both to you and others around you. Izuku's breath caught. Dangerous. Nizu thought his analysis could be dangerous. Wait, did he say quirkless? Wait, how dash? You need guidance, proper oversight, and access to resources that can help you understand the difference between theoretical analysis and practical application. The principal interrupted, not even acknowledging his question. You also need to understand the ethical and legal constraints that govern investigative work and the consequences of amateur interference in active cases. The principal's expression shifted into something that might have been enthusiastic if it weren't for the calculating gleam that never quite left his eyes. I'd like to arrange for you to work with some professionals who can evaluate your analytical approach more thoroughly than I can in a brief conversation. People who can teach you about the practical realities of investigative work while keeping you from accidentally interfering with active operations. What kind of professionals? Izuku asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Was this truly happening? Detective Tsukachi, certainly, since you've already established that connection and he's expressed interest in your capabilities. But I was also thinking of someone else. I have a specific hero in mind. Someone who understands both the value of systematic thought process and the dangers of overconfidence in one's conclusions. Nizu glanced toward the back of the lecture hall, and Izuku noticed for the first time that someone had been standing in the shadows there throughout their conversation. Eraserhead, would you care to join us? I believe you've been listening long enough. The man stepped forward into the light, and Izuku's world tilted sideways. Eraserhead. He'd heard of the man. He's gotten so interested he'd tried with all his might to find every information he could on the man. But the amount of data about him on the internet was so scarce. The analysis had been much smaller than he'd have hoped for. The underground hero moved like a shadow, gaining physical form. His capture weapon hung around his shoulders like a sleeping serpent, and his dark eyes fixed on Izuku. Nizu-sensei, Aizawa said, his voice a low rumble, are you seriously considering involving a high school student in active investigative work? Oh, he's already involved, Aizawa-san, Nizu replied cheerfully. The question is whether we provide proper guidance or allow him to continue conducting independently. Which option do you think is more dangerous? Aizawa's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested resignation. He turned to the boy. Show me the analysis. Izuku handed over his notebook with trembling hands, watching as Eraserhead, Aizawa, examined his work with the same methodical attention Nizu had shown. The hero's face revealed nothing, but occasionally his eyes would narrow slightly at particular pages, or his finger would trace a connection between different sections. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. "This is very well made," Aizawa finally said, closing the notebook. "More detailed than some official case files, and much more than I see with my usual students. Your methodology is impressive, your observations are thorough, and your conclusions follow logically." He paused, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You have real talent for this." Relief flooded through Izuku so intensely he nearly swayed. "However," Aizawa continued, his tone becoming more measured, "as Nizu said, you're working with incomplete information, making assumptions about operational constraints you don't yet understand, and developing strategies that ignore practical limitations you haven't considered. And you're treating this like an academic exercise when it's an active situation involving real people who could be harmed by poorly executed interference." The criticism landed like physical blows, each one accurate and devastating. He tried to at least not let it show. "Oh, show some mercy, Aizawa-san," Nizu chirped. Aizawa ignored him, still looking at Izuku. "Your analysis shows incredible capability, but it also shows dangerous gaps in your understanding of how this type of thing actually works in practice. You need proper training, oversight, and guidance on the difference between theoretical analysis and real, operational support." His voice dropped slightly. "But those gaps can be filled. That's what training is for." Aizawa looked at Nizu, his expression unreadable. "You want me to take him on as a project? Is that why you messaged me with such urgency?" "I think he could benefit enormously from your guidance," Nizu replied, his smile widening. "And I think you might find his analytical capabilities truly interesting. At the very least, it would give you someone to direct besides your students when you're in a particularly critical mood. Especially since only 5 students remain in this year's class." "I'm always in a critical mood." "Exactly. It's perfect. Besides," Nizu's expression shifted into something more serious, "you know that if we don't provide proper guidance, he'll continue conducting independent analysis. I don't judge, I was exactly the same in the past. But, eventually he'll either interfere with an active case and get himself in serious trouble, or, worst case, actually be right about something and have no idea how to properly report it to authorities." Aizawa studied Izuku for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing in a way that made Izuku want to fidget. "Can you follow instructions?" the hero asked finally. "Yes, sir." "Can you accept criticism without making excuses?" Yes, sir. I want to learn." "Can you admit when you're wrong?" The question felt more important than the previous ones. Izuku thought about his analysis, about all the assumptions he'd made, all the gaps in his knowledge that professionals had immediately identified. He didn't know what gaps were so apparent, but it must be catastrophic if both of them noticed. "Yes, sir. I don't know more than I do know. I just want to learn how to do this properly. It would mean the world to me." Aizawa's expression didn't soften, but something in his posture shifted slightly. "That's the right answer." "Good." He paused. "There are going to be rules, and if you break them, this arrangement ends immediately. Understood?" "Yes, sir." His mouth curled into a slight smile that held a hint of challenge. Rule 1. No independent analysis of active cases without XPLCT permission. Everything goes through me or Detective Tsukachi before you act on it in any way. If you'd like, you may work on cold cases or completed ones. You understood? Rule 2. You will complete whatever educational assignments I give you, even if they seem unrelated to your analytical interests. You have gaps in your knowledge that need to be filled, but that's normal for someone your age. Of course, sir. Rule 3. If I tell you to drop something, you drop it. No arguments, no exceptions. Some information is classified or dangerous for good reasons. I'll always give you a sound explanation on why I'm asking you to stop, but sometimes, things may be urgent enough I need to know you'll listen if I utter a single word. Izuku nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Good, Aizawa said, nodding. We'll start with a meeting next Saturday. Bring your notebooks, your analysis, and a willingness to have your assumptions challenged. I'm sure Nizu is already arranging to have Detective Tsukachi be there as well. I'm not qualified to teach investigative methodology alone, and this needs to be done properly. Nizu looked up from his phone with a cheeky smile. Thank you, Izuku managed, the words feeling inadequate for what was being offered. I won't let you down, sir. You'll make mistakes, Aizawa replied, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite softening, but perhaps recalibrating. Everyone does when they're learning. The key is learning from them. He paused. You have the foundation worth building on. That's more than most people start with. The last sentence was delivered in a tone that was almost encouraging, and Izuku caught it, an acknowledgement that Aizawa saw something in his work beyond just problems to fix. Thank gosh. Principal Nizu clapped his paws together with obvious delight. Wonderful. This should be absolutely fascinating to observe. Aizawa-san mentoring someone just as analytical. I can already imagine the chaos. You're not going to observe, Aizawa said flatly. Oh, but I am, Nizu replied cheerfully. Not directly, of course, that would be intrusive. But I'll want regular reports on Midoriyukuin's progress. After all, if he develops his capabilities properly, he might eventually become quite valuable to UA. We could always use skilled analysts. The implication hung in the air. This wasn't just about helping Izuku develop his skills. Nizu was evaluating him as a potential future asset, someone who might eventually contribute to UA in an official capacity. He felt used, sure, but he wasn't about to miss this opportunity. We'll discuss that if and when he proves capable of meeting professional standards, Aizawa said. Right now, he's a high school student with raw talent and potential. Let's focus on developing that before we discuss career prospects. Of course. Nizu agreed, but his smile suggested he'd already thought of multiple potential futures and found them all intriguing. Midoriyukuin, I look forward to seeing how you develop. Do try not to interfere with any active investigations before your first training session. I won't, sir. I promise. Excellent. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have several other matters to attend to. Aizawa-san, the details? Aizawa pulled out his phone and handed it to Izuku. Put in your contact information and your guardians. I'll be personally sending them what we plan on doing. Do know that if they refuse, we'll have to stop this short. I'll send you the time and location for Saturday's meeting. Be on time, bring everything relevant to your analysis, and be ready to work hard. Izuku entered the information with trembling fingers, still not quite believing this was actually happening. Eraserhead was going to, apparently, train him. He was scary, but seemed like a good teacher. Detective Tsukachi was also going to be involved. Principal Nizu thought he might eventually be valuable to UA. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped through some invisible barrier into a version of reality where his obsessions were actually taken seriously. One more thing, Aizawa said as Izuku handed back the phone. Your hypothesis, the one you've been developing about the issues of the hero system. Write it out formally before Saturday. Clear statement of the hypothesis, the evidence supporting it, the assumptions you're making, and the limitations of your current analysis. If you're going to do this work, you need to learn to document your thinking in ways that others can evaluate and critique. I will be sending you references you may use. Like the scientific method? Izuku said, the connection clicking into place. Exactly like the scientific method. Analysis is science. From now on, you're conducting research, not just making observations. Treat it that way. After exchanging a few more practical details, Aizawa departed with the same silent efficiency he'd arrived with, leaving Izuku alone with the empty lecture hall and the surreal awareness that his life had just shifted in ways he couldn't fully process. He pulled out his notepad and stared at the blank page. A formal hypothesis. Clear documentation of his thinking, his assumptions, his limitations. He needed to identify what he had to change. He'd redo the hypothesis once he received whatever Eraserhead was planning on giving him. On the page, he began to write, assumptions that I need change, that I have accurately identified genuine tactical errors rather than context-dependent decisions. That publicly available information provides sufficient data for meaningful pattern recognition. That cognitive limitations observed in training environments always translate to field conditions. That heroes would implement analytical support with no issue if properly demonstrated. My limitations: no access to classified operational data or internal agency communications. No formal training. No understanding of practical constraints faced in the field. Analysis based on incomplete information filtered through media coverage. No actual field experience to validate the theoretical frameworks. He stared at what he'd written, seeing his work through new eyes. Everything he'd done till now was potentially flawed. Each one of his limitations represented gaps in his knowledge that could invalidate his entire approach. And yet, the patterns were still real. The cognitive limitations Nizu had described were documented scientific fact. The potential value of external analytical support was supported by both research and international examples. He wasn't wrong to pursue this. He'd just been naive about how much he still needed to learn. The walk home from UA felt different than the walk there. Izuku still didn't belong at the prestigious hero school, still wore a middle school uniform among students preparing for careers he'd never have access to. But now he had something he hadn't had before, a path forward. Not because they pitted him. Principal Nizu personally said so, and Eraserhead didn't change the way he acts just because of him. Not because they wanted to encourage a quirkless kid with impossible dreams. But because they saw genuine capability that, with proper development, might actually contribute to keeping people safe. His phone buzzed as he waited at a crosswalk. A text from an unknown number. Saturday, 9 a.m. Muzutafu Police Headquarters, Conference Room C. Bring notebooks, formal hypothesis documentation, and realistic expectations. I will send you the documents I want you to read as soon as I get home. Aizawa. Izuku saved the number and read the message 3 more times, letting the reality sink in. Saturday. 5 days away. 5 days to prepare, to review his analysis, to document his thinking in ways that would withstand professional scrutiny. 5 days to construct a hypothesis that might actually be worth testing. 5 days to transform his observations into something resembling actual research methodology. 5 days to prove he deserved the opportunity he'd been given. When Izuku arrived home, his mother looked up from dinner preparation with the particular expression she'd developed over the years, one that meant she could tell something significant had happened just from the way he carried himself. "How was the lecture?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral in the way that invited honesty without demanding it. "It was." Izuku paused, trying to find words adequate to describe what had happened. "It was life-changing, Mum. Principal Nizu of all people saw my analysis, and he think I have genuine capability. Mom, he called in a hero and they plan to help me. They're going to help me develop things properly," he nearly screamed. Inko's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog: surprise, concern, pride, worry, hope. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Though I have to ask, is this safe? Working with heroes and police investigations." "Safer than what I was doing before," Izuku admitted. "They're going to teach me about practical part of things and ethical limitations. Make sure I understand the difference between the theoretical analysis I've been conducting and real operational work. Mom, this is an opportunity one just can't miss. It's so serious they'll even send you messages informing you about it." His mother studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly with a watery smile. "I'm just so proud of you," Inko said, and the simple statement made Izuku's chest tight with emotion. "For pursuing this seriously, for being willing to learn, for finding people who will help you do it properly. Just promise me you'll be careful, and that you'll tell me if anything feels wrong or unsafe." "I promise, Mom." That night, Izuku worked late into the early morning hours, transforming scattered observations into systematic documentation, with the help of the documents Eraserhead, Aizawa? Should he call him Aizawa-sensei? Sent him. The smokescreen analysis was reorganized into clear sections, each conclusion traced back to specific evidence. Each assumption was explicitly noted. It was meticulous, exhausting work, the kind that made his eyes burn and his hand cramp from constant writing. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways his previous analysis hadn't been. This wasn't just note-taking or pattern observation. This was now actual research, structured and documented in ways that others could evaluate and build upon. By 3 a.m., he had a comprehensive document that laid out his analysis with brutal honesty about its limitations and gaps. It wasn't perfect. He himself could already see flaws in his reasoning, places where he'd made assumptions he couldn't fully justify, but it was honest. And maybe, just maybe, it was good enough to be the foundation for something better.